Good afternoon. Delighted to be here today. My name is Scott Brison. I'm Vice Chair at BMO. We're a Canadian bank, but we are also North America's 8th largest financial institution. And I'm here today with Senor Imaz, CEO of Repsol, to talk about energy transition in Europe and in the global context. And I'm delighted to be here with him in part because he spent 13 years of his life serving the people as an elected politician, as somebody who devoted a significant part of his life to public service. And it sounds a little self-serving for me to say that I have great regard for people like that, because I spent some time in public service in my country, in Canada, as well. And I'm looking forward to your perspective today, Senor Imaz, on energy transition. So welcome.
So, tout d'abord, merci pour m'accueillir.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this day.
You mentioned, Scott, I spent 1/3 of my life in the midst of my career in the public service, and 2/3 in the private service. So I have both experiences, but it's true that the main part of my career has been developed in the private side.
Yeah, well, there's not a lot of people in government who understand business, and frankly, there's not a lot of people in business who understand government. So I think you're well equipped to bring a lot of value to Repsol, and you've been there 13 years as CEO.
12 and a half years as CEO of the company. I was appointed as CEO of the company after leading the refining, chemical, and later the whole industrial businesses of Repsol. I was appointed in 2014 as CEO of the company.
And that makes you one of the longer serving CEOs of European companies, I would say.
The longest one, probably.
Well, that's, I guess, the experience in big politics probably helps you in a company as well sometimes.
I don't know, but let me say that politics is a way to manage complexity.
Yes.
I mean, you have a lot of variables you have to manage.
Yeah.
And that could be useful when you are engaged in businesses. And I have to say that, I mean, at the very beginning of my career, I'm a scientist. I'm a physical doctor in chemicals. I was a researcher for years. After that, I work in the industrial sector. So, I mean, I have, let me say, many different experiences over my professional career.
Well, let's talk about some of the complexities you're dealing with as a CEO of an energy company today in Europe with global reach. The EU elections in 2024, the US election in 2024 mean that we have a new EU Commission and a new US administration coming on board in 2025 with Trump 47. What do you see as the impact on energy transition policy in Europe and in the US? There, whether it's on carbon pricing or government subsidies or investment in energy transition. How do you see these changes in terms of the transatlantic relationship?
Oh, before jumping into the energy transition, let me say that when I entered in this building this morning, I read a statement that was written by George W. Bush in 1928, saying that in this place, in this building, are the roots of what was the beginning of the European unity. That resulted in what was later the European Union, NATO, and in some way the continuity of the Marshall Plan that this century could be in some way OECD. So, I mean, and after reading this statement, I thought that when we are talking about transatlantic cooperation, we are not talking about business. We are not talking about energy. We are talking about values. We share democracy, we share the value of rule of law, the balance of power, human rights. I mean, all that is shared in both sides of the pond. So I think that we have to preserve this relationship. And now we have a new time where we are going to have a new American government and we are going to have a new European Commission. So I think that it's really important to start increasing again this cooperation framework between both sides of the pond, because we have the same concern. The same concern we have is China. China that is using in some way the energy transition as a weapon to increase the geopolitical influence they could have in the world. That sometimes, as they did in 2010, used the rare earths and some other critical materials as a weapon with the embargo to Japan, for instance. So we have the same concerns, we have the same value. So I think that we have a strong push and a strong commitment and a strong driver to increase our cooperation. And going to the energy transition, I mean, let me say that 15 years ago, in 2010, Europe account at that time for more or less at 22% of the global GDP, the global economy. It was exactly the same percentage that the US had at that time. 14 years later, Europe, we are now tiny, 17%, and the US, they accounted for 27%. So we are, let me say, doing things in the wrong way. When Draghi analyzed in his report this situation, the conclusion is clear. We need a radical change. And we need a radical change in terms of the energy policy, in terms of energy transition. I mean, an energy policy has to fulfill a trilemma, 3 targets. First of all, the security of supply. Secondly, we need cheap energy, affordability. And third, we have to decarbonize this energy. But in Europe, we forgot the first one and the second one. And we were fully focused on decarbonizing the energy. So the consequence is that we forgot security of supply and we built dependence on Russia. And now we are building a new dependence on China with the critical minerals we need for the energy transition. We forgot the concept of affordability. And for 2 years, European families, they have had difficulties to pay the energy bills at home. Our industry can't pay the energy bill. We have lost, as also is announced in the Draghi report, at 12% of European energy-consuming industry over the last 6 years. I mean, the European industry is becoming smaller and smaller. And you could say, okay, that's positive because we are decarbonizing Europe. That's not true. It's a big lie. We are not decarbonizing the world. We are decarbonizing Europe. But what we are doing is exporting CO2 emissions to some other parts of the world. European industries, they are shutting down. We are exporting industries, we are exporting jobs, and we are exporting CO2 emissions. I'm going to put you an example. The total emissions of Europe today accounts for an 8% worldwide. I mean, we are an 8% of the total emissions in the world. If we take only 2 Chinese sectors, cement and steel, they emit an 8% of the total global emissions, so the same figure than Europe. I mean, every time an European industry is shutting down and we start importing steel from China, as average, this Chinese plant is emitting a 50% more than the emissions we previously had in Europe. And on top of that, we have to add the CO2 emitted in the transport. We took some decisions as deciding, not producing more natural gas in Europe. You could say that's positive because we are decarbonizing Europe. What has had the consequence? The consequence has had that we have started importing LNG from all parts of the world, increasing the LNG price in the world, and making it impossible for the global south to acquire, to buy the LNG, the gas they need to feed their economy. So they are shifting from gas to coal. If you take the figures in terms of CO2 global emissions from 2022 and 2023, we could see a CO2 increase in the world. The main reason for this emission is the coal burning to produce power. And the main driver for that is the appetite of Europe to acquire the gas all over the world. So we are contributing in a decisive way to increase the CO2 emissions in the world. So we are failing in the three targets. We need a more holistic approach to solve this problem, because what we are doing is not effective at all. It's not effective in terms of strategic autonomy. It's not effective in terms of competitiveness of the economy, and it's not reducing the CO2 emissions.
You spoke of affordability, and cost of living issues are creating a lot of political instability as the people, the citizens, are struggling just to feed their families and to keep to house and feed their families and to pay rising energy costs. At the same time, you spoke about economic competitiveness. Jobs are critically important to political stability. The political elite have operated in a bit of an ivory tower around some of these issues. Do you think that the new EU Commission will be sensitive to the realities facing business and families and the challenges they face? Will they be out of touch with those realities?
I mean, I don't know, but they must, because that is happening. And in my opinion, over the last years, we have seen in Europe an energy transition that is driven by ideology. It's not driven by technology. And we have to change radically, as Draghi says in his report, this view. I'm going to put you on examples. We have taken real bad decisions over the last 3-4 years. One of them, to ban the combustion engine by 2035 in Europe. We had the main industrial sector in Europe is the automotive sector. We have today 2.3 million direct jobs, and almost 13 if we consider direct and indirect in this sector. We are destroying the European automotive sector. You could read news about what is happening with Stellantis in Italy, with Volkswagen in Germany, with Audi in Belgium. And what is the real consequence of this policy on our societies and in terms of emission? I'm going to put you an example. Because we are creating a mobility for rich people, because a main part of European society can't afford to buy an electric vehicle. What is happening is that the electric car fleet the car fleet is becoming older and older. The Spanish case, for instance, in 2008, the average car fleet in Spain had 8 years. It was 8 years old. Today the figure is approaching 15 years. What is the consequence of that? The consequence of that is that we are not taking advantage of the technologies we have today to reduce CO2 emissions, because we could substitute these cars by new cars, gasoline, either diesel, either electric car. I'm not suspicious. 15 years ago, I put in operation the first electric vehicle recharging company in Spain. But we could use all these technologies, but because we have policies driven by ideology that they are only focused in one technology, we are not taking advantage of this substitution. Another example, we are launching to car makers the message that they are going to be out in 2035. What is the consequence of that? They are not investing anymore in the combustion engine efficiency. So we are losing the opportunity of a decade to reduce our emissions. And saying more, we are not measuring the CO2 emissions, because this electric vehicle is emitting CO2, and it's emitting a lot of CO2. But we are not taking into consideration the emissions in the Chinese mining, in the production of this battery in China, using power produced by coal. And now, if we take the facts, the figures, the maths, a hybrid in Germany, and a small hybrid in Germany, is emitting less CO2, taking into account the German, for instance, power basket than an electric vehicle. But we are taking an ideological approach that is not based on facts, on science.
So the COP agreements are written by people who are very focused on fighting climate change, but they're also can be quite ideological in their perspective, particularly around things like Scope 3 emissions and the way they're measured. In countries like Canada, we don't get behind, for instance, natural gas projects that could be used to displace coal in countries like Germany and help geopolitically vis-a-vis Russia, but also reduce global emissions. But we don't do that because of, we have a cap on our hydrocarbon energy put in by the government, a part of a government that I used to be a minister in. Is there a risk that these COP agreements that, as you said, incent us to, within our own countries, decarbonize, are actually limiting the ability for us to play a bigger role in decarbonizing the world, or potentially using things like natural gas as a transition fuel, as an example? Is the ideologically infused COP framework, should that be rethought and become more practical globally?
First of all, I have a strong commitment in terms of CO2 reduction. My own company, and I led that process, was 5 years ago the first oil and gas company in the world committing with being net zero by 2050. 35% of our capex year after year is applied in low carbon technologies. We have reduced our carbon intensity index over the last 7 years, including Scope 3, in up 15%. So I have a strong commitment. And because I have this commitment, I'm credible to say that. We can't afford the oil and gas problem reducing the supply, because the demand is growing year after year, and next year the demand is going to be higher, and in 3 years it's going to be higher. So the carpet you put here under my seat is produced by oil. This micro has been produced using oil. The cables I'm seeing here, all of them are produced using oil. The parts of an electric vehicle are produced using oil. The blades of the electric wind farms are produced with oil. The solar photovoltaic panels are produced with oil. We are going to need a lot of oil in the world. And even in our net zero with no emissions, we are going to need asphalts. We are going to need polymers. We are more energy transition.
Battery minerals.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
So if we restrict the supply, what we are going to do is push prices up for the future. So we are going to create a social problem in our society. If we put this kind of problems for gas, we are going to lose the possibility to shift from coal to gas. If you analyze the figures of the US over the last 15 years, they have performed better than many European countries like Germany, Poland, and some others in terms of CO2 emissions. And the driver of the reduction has been, of course, energy efficiency, renewable power, and shifting from coal to gas. Today, the main emitter in the world in terms of CO2 is the electric production, is power production, because coal is massively used to produce power. So only shifting from coal to gas, we will be able to reduce enough 15% the total CO2 emissions worldwide. So every time you are putting restrictions in Canada to export this gas from Alberta to the Pacific to feed Asia and the growth of these Asian countries, you are contributing in a decisive way to increase the CO2 emissions in the world.
Well, I'm going to take that message back home to Prime Minister Trudeau, who
I know. I think that in Alberta
sometime today we'll have a new finance minister, we're told. Canadian politics intervening as it sometimes does. U.S. Protectionism combined with policies to isolate China economically, combined with China's leadership on the EV side, and I see these billboards around everywhere in Paris for BYD cars, which I'm told are quite affordable and are a pretty good car. 10 years ago, everybody was saying the biggest risk to the world is climate change. Today, we have a government who's saying the biggest risk in the U.S., that the biggest risk in the world is China. How do we reconcile those two if, in fact, the biggest risk is climate change? Should we be balkanizing our efforts to fight it around ideology? China has one form of government and economic management. We have another. You spoke to values. The problem with values-based foreign policy is that we're always implying that our values are better than somebody else's values. But do you think? How do you thread that needle in the U.S. today, which is anti-China and protectionist? How do you thread that needle with fighting climate change if these protectionist and nativist tendencies are balkanizing efforts to actually develop the solutions?
So, but let's go again to the facts. The U.S. is year after year reducing its CO2 emissions with Obama, with Trump, with Biden, and no doubt that they are going to go on reducing emissions with Trump. That is going to happen in coming 4 years. And in the meantime, China is year after year increasing its emissions. So please, China is not a model in terms of coping with the energy transition. They could have, of course, some positive things, but I mean, the US has been able over these years, first of all, to increase their security of supply. Secondly, to have a more competitive industry that we, the Europeans, we have. And let me say that I'm very sad saying that. Creating more industrial jobs than in Europe and reducing the CO2 emissions in a dramatic way. And let me say more. I mean, the view that the Americans, they have, Americans, the US, because you are also Americans from Canada, the US, they have about the energy transition. First of all, it's a transition that because the commitment with the climate change is a long-term commitment, has to be financed by taxpayers. Here in Europe, I mean, we are putting all this weight on consumers. So we are making a very expensive energy transition that consumers, they can't pay. And here in Europe, we are using the stick to cope with this energy transition, banning A, banning B, banning C. I mean, politicians making decisions about future technologies that are not in their hands. Another principle that is written in stone in the Draghi report, we have to respect the technological neutrality principles. I mean, I spent some years in politics. I was not able to say which technologies they are going to win in 2040, 2045. That is stupid. And we are doing these kind of things here. Politicians are deciding what kind of technologies are going to win. We have to let technologies to compete. I mean, the defy. We have the challenge of climate change is very serious. And we need technologies competing. And we need all technologies and more. A lot of them, they are in our hands. Energy efficiency, gas, nuclear, renewable fuels. I mean, not everything is electrification. I mean, 77% of the economy is not electrified. And it's not going to be electrified in coming years. Because in Europe, 5 years ago, the electrification part of the pipe was exactly the 23%, the same that we have now. So we need a broader view. We need more technology. We need less ideology on that.
So along those same themes, you have been direct in your criticism of EU regulatory policy inflexibility and lack of coordination, incoherence in some ways with reality. How do you, as an energy company, develop your long-term plan in an environment of regulatory and policy frameworks that are incoherent, inflexible, and uncoordinated?
It's complex, but we have to do it. I mean, first of all, let me say that we need to push the energy transition. That is not a revolution. It's a transition, and transition means that we are going to need 2-3 decades to decarbonize our society. So our moral responsibility is to go on producing oil. Our moral responsibility is to go on producing gas, because our society, I mean, you used our products to come here to Paris. You don't have any alternative to come here by plane. I mean, all these products I mentioned before, they need the oil production. So we have to do that. But at the same time, we have another moral responsibility. The moral responsibility is to decarbonize the scope 3 of the products we produce. So we have a clear policy of investing in both sides of the system. It's more expensive. It's more complex. And it's not sometimes easy because, I mean, we need investors ready to do that. I'm sure that here there are investors investing in renewable energies. And some of them, they could take companies like Repsol and some others, and they could say, okay, you are great, but we are not going to invest in Repsol because you are producing gas with fracking in the US. I mean, first of all, let me say that fracking saved Europe over the last 2 years. I mean, we have to recognize that fracking saved Europe. And, I mean, but we don't want fracking in Europe. We prefer, I mean, to emit in the US, to add to these emissions the CO2, to transport this gas to Europe and to burn this product in Europe, I mean, emitting more CO2 in the whole system.
Well,
but we have, I mean, and these kind of investors, they are not ready to invest. And we have some other investors that they say, okay, but I'm an investor investing in oil and gas. What are you doing investing at 35% of your capex in these renewable technologies when you have, I mean, models like Chevron, Exxon, they are taking the opportunity. So it's a more complex journey. But we need people ready to invest in the energy transition. Otherwise, we are not going to cope with this problem.
But some of the ideologues in the environmental community don't really confuse themselves with facts around things like fracking. And one could say that they don't know what the frack they're talking about, in a sense, but a couple of you got that, I think. The tough crowd. Look, I think we're over time.
Let me only add a thing, Scott. I mean, without the fracking in North America, we only have 2 alternatives. First, full dependence on Putin, or secondly, to see European families suffering because they can't pay the bill. There is no alternative in the middle today with the current technologies.
And fracking, depending on geology, can be done sustainably, and you know, it is actually extremely important to energy security. We've seen that in the U.S. In terms of its impact on energy prices for American families. We've seen a lot of Canadian families from all over Canada with jobs in Fort McMurray and other places, but also, there are companies on the East Coast where I'm from, like Irving Oil as an example. It is really important that we get this right now. We are over time, which is not exactly unsurprising given we have 2 former politicians on the stage, but I got to tell you, I hope you end up back in politics someday. I'd contribute to your campaign if they let me, and if you'd run in Canada, I'd vote for you. I very much adhere to the common sense and directness. I think a lot of politicians today think, and the strategists from whom they take advice think the people are stupid. And my experience is that you can trust the people. You just have to be prepared to tell them the truth. And they will, in fact, embrace things that are not convenient in the short term if they trust you. I, even though we've not had a lot of time together, I think you'd earn my trust if you put your name on a ballot again and entered public life. In the interim, you're doing a great job running Repsol in a complex environment. And I wish you and Repsol well. And of course, for any of your banking, investment banking, or capital markets needs anywhere, or particularly North America, I would hope you'd call BMO. Because we're very good at this kind of thing.
Thank you, Scott.
Very much.
I mean, I'm not going to go to politics back. I mean, that was over. But I think that is the moral responsibility of business people to tell their truth and to speak in a clear way. And I think that the challenge we have in our hands in terms of climate change and in terms of decarbonizing the economy is asking for a clear language, saying to our people the truth, in terms that is going to be expensive, and we have to preserve the competitiveness of our industry in this journey. Otherwise, we are not going to have the economic resources we need in Europe to sustain the current society, to create jobs and well-paid jobs for young people. We are going to lose the competitiveness. And on top of that, we are not going to contribute in any way to reduce the CO2 emissions in the world. Simply, we are going to export these emissions to some other places. And emitting in Paris CO2, emitting in Shanghai is exactly the same, because the CO2, I mean, is not a local polluter. So we have to take the holistic approach, and we need a real technological and transparent debate about that. And in Europe, and I mean, I'm saying that, but that is not relevant, my opinion. The Draghi report is very clear about that. We have to rethink the energy transition.
Senor Imaz, we're getting the hook here. I do have one request for you. Next time you're in Canada, can we have a conversation like this? Where you speak just as clearly and eloquently and honestly about energy transition, because I think a lot of Canadians would find this candor and common sense quite attractive, and it's a very important message. So would you agree to do that sometime?
I did it some years ago in the conference of Montreal and in Toronto, in these conferences organized by Monsieur Remillard. I'm ready to do it again.
Yeah, but you didn't do it.
And slowly.
But you didn't do it with me.
That is an important point. But on top of that, I think that happened 5, 6, 7 years ago. And now we are seeing the consequences of some of our political mistakes in Europe.
And perhaps even a few of them in Canada.
I don't want to enter in Canadian politics, sorry.
Well, neither do I right now. But thank you.